Three,
two,
two, one.
Let's
go!
go!
Skip-o!
We're back. We're back.
We're back. The arches are back.
The
We're
arches
back
are
with
still good. The Wi-Fi is still great here. It's a blessing, man. No one's here. That pandemic, man. It's been a blast.
This show was a blast. This show was absolutely bananas with the experience of Duncan Blue and what we talk about on this show.
I mean, just from the conception of it to understanding technology to business development to, just the end and where we see the future of this business going. And as far as even policy, that we even get into that. But man, this was a fun show to do.
It was fun for me, I'll tell you. Yeah.
And Duncan Blue, sir, I'm going to read your bio. Duncan Blue is the owner of Duncan Blue Consulting with 45 years of experience across the globe with several major service companies working in new product development and product management. Along with several published papers and articles, Duncan also holds several patents, most notably one that led to Baker Hughes rig count revamp. Duncan has a passion for building brands, developing people, and transforming technology. Your bio, short, but absolutely accurate based on our conversation from today in this show.
Well, great. Thanks for the commercial. That's good.
We'll run it. I mean, the show, like Skips was talking about, from conception drill down to completion, ultimately, where are we with our physical understanding of the planet and these resources that we have and our ability to get these things out to run successful businesses and sustain energy for our planet, or the lubricants we need from oil and gas, using this stuff to make sense and make our a more stable future. That's what this show is really all about. And we talk about all kinds of good stuff.
I mean, from taking the similarities of this most recent crash to looking back at the crash of '82, correct? And understanding, hey, we've done this before. We should have seen this coming.
Too many times, yeah.
Too many times. And it's just one of those things where, banking gets involved in oil and gas and vice versa. And I thought that was the most fascinating thing. I didn't know the details about, the funny money and getting down the rabbit hole. I mean, I wish I owned a used cars lot and then just start an oil company.
Yep. Too many of that happened. Yeah.
Wow.
What was your favorite part, T-Roy?
Man, I mean, for me, there's a lot that I focus on when I read, and I'm watching what's going on LinkedIn. I'm watching how I respond to what the environment is forcing us all into as professionals. And I'm so excited as a geoscientist on the fact that we know this planet is a hydrocarbon generating planet. And we also know that we're getting about 10% of 100% recovery factors out of these unconventional wells. And if we can go back with new ideas and apply these new technologies that are coming with these new ideas that are developing as we speak, there is 90% growth in performance.
Wait, what company's getting 10%? Killing it.
I was being nice.
He's doing great. Yeah.
I was being nice. But that's where, so it goes back to this passion that I have and that I listen to other people speak about. What are we going to do with all this? We have the power of AI and these machines that can do these amazing things. But at the same time, we're all realizing that we got to hit the brakes a little bit. Let's understand the physical problems, the physical world, apply that into the machines that are waiting to make something from all this. And that's, to me, this show hit that nail on the head.
Yep.
Mr. Duncan, what did you get from this show?
Well, I got that there's still interest out there. There's still passion out there. There's a lot of good folks that unfortunately there's a whole bunch of folks in the oil and gas industry, especially, but all over the country that are now finding themselves out of work, but still have a huge amount of knowledge and capability and fortitude to go out and do things. Maybe this is a great opportunity for all those folks to maybe spark out on their own and form their own company, or get with some other like-minded people and try to do something and make things happen. some of the most successful people in the world. You read about the story of the guy who started Barden's dairy. He failed 52 times before he finally hit on the right formula to pasteurize his milk and make it available to the country. So if you find somebody that says they've never failed and never had setbacks, get away from them. You're going to get hurt. Something's going to happen to that guy. So you got to have confidence. Things are going to work out. So just keep trying and keep the right attitude there, and market yourself. Go out and talk to as many people as you can. Don't just sit back and wait for people to say, "Hey, would you like to have a job here?" Go out and make yourself known and visible, and do things, and meet as many people as you can. Use LinkedIn to your advantage to talk to people every day on it. Go to SPE meet and greets. Go to IADC meetings. Do whatever you can to get out there and get yourself known.
Yep. This show, without question, it was very, very optimistic and very hopeful, but it was grounded by the reality and the experience of someone with 45 years in the industry. You've seen it, you've walked it, and you're looking at it again, and you're inspiring this next generation. They're listening. We are responding. No question about it. Skippo out right there. That dude's gonna change the world. It's happening. No question about it.
I wouldn't say that. I'm going to change some things. I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to leave my impact.
Dude.
Well, and that's all we can do. That's all we can do. Each do our own piece and make it the best you can.
That's right. That's right.
Yes, sir.
While knowing that when you look back at 82 and you look today and you realize that something like an energy policy could allow us an opportunity to build a stable foundation for the working system. Mm-hmm. We got to get away from this instability in the oil and gas industry or energy industry. If it's just going to be this roller coaster ride, that we are going to lose so much interest from academia. The students, the kids are not dumb. They're not looking at this going, that's something I want to get involved in. I'm going to go grind out 6 years and get degrees and all that. And then you come into a bust. We can't live with busts anymore. It's not highs and lows. We need to find this stable wave, ride that thing out.
You're right. I in my career, I've had to hire a whole bunch of people, and I've had to fire a bunch of people. And I can tell you this last downturn probably hurt me more than any other, because some of these kids that we had, they were so enthusiastic, they were so smart, they were so dedicated, and this downturn caused we had to lay them off, and that made me physically hurt.
Man, yeah, I could feel that. I could feel it over the microphones, no question about it. Skippo, you got anything to add to the end of this show before we wrap this up?
I think that's it. I think everyone's in for quite the treat with this show. I'm just going to put it that way.
Well, we are joined by Duncan Blue, and this is the conception part of the PBE podcast with Duncan, and we're going to dive into what was happening in the 82 crash, the parallels and the similarities of the crash in today's market. But before we get there, we always want to get to know you. We want to get to know what is going on with Duncan Blue today, what went into building Duncan Blue, the consultant. Let's get your background, and let's get to know each other.
Sure. I've been in the industry for 42 plus years. Came out of college with a business degree. Had no idea what I wanted to be when I grew up. I still don't. But I had an opportunity to actually go to work for a little small mudlogging company. I got all excited because they were going to pay me about twice what I was making working at a bank. And then I said, well, what is a mudlogger? And that they had to hold my hand through that. And over my career, I've ended up working as a sample catcher in a mudlogging operation to actually running two of the largest mudlogging groups in the world, one for Baker Hughes and one for Halliburton. I was with Baker for over 25 years in various jobs, some field work. I worked in marketing. I did a lot of put ads together, working with a really creative marketing group, won quite a few ad awards as far as some of the graphics that we put together and new tools. And then I got involved in the e-commerce side of things. We wanted to build a e-commerce site at Baker Hughes, and good Lord, this has to have been, I'm saying, almost 20 years ago. And so I took on that job, running that project for our division, and learned quite a bit about computers. Although having worked in the field, I knew a lot about it. But as far as how all these kind of things come together, and I learned a lot there. One of my highlights working at Baker, besides the 3 or 4 patents or five patents that I hold, is I was tasked to develop the new Baker Hughes rig count site. The Baker Hughes rig count is probably one of the most utilized pieces of software in the entire oil and gas industry. Interesting story behind that, the fact that our CEO was in front of some customers and got reamed terribly about it because the numbers were wrong. Well, he came back and went into my boss's office, and I happened to be sitting there at the time, and was yelling at my boss and said, "This has got to be fixed. You make sure it's done. I don't care how it gets happened." And then my boss, and he looked at me and said, "You're in charge of it." And they both walked out. I said, "Oh, great.
It's funny how those things work, right?
Yeah,
I'm not doing it. You do it. All right. I want my job.
I soon discovered that because the CEO said that, I didn't have a budget. I could do whatever I wanted to do. So that was great. So I called in a team, and we started working on the problem, realizing that the way we had traditionally counted the rigs since 1942, I think was the first when they started being counted, there were some flaws in the process. So what we had to do is really discover the best way of how those rigs could be counted. And we ended up with what we called an accounting system. So that, the debits and the credits, if a rig was one place one week and it wasn't there that week, it had to go somewhere else. So we had to figure out a way how we could track those individual rigs as they moved across the country, wherever they ended up, so that the individual field salesman would know where his rig was, what new rigs were coming into his area, how they could account for that, and then how all that could be rolled up once a week into an accurate rig count for the industry.
I mean, that's a powerful tool, not only for operators, but for other oil field service companies as well.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
The business of oil and gas.
Absolutely. And trends can be found on that. What are the hot areas? Where are people moving rigs? Why are they moving them there? Sometimes you don't see the big picture because you're so involved in your day-to-day operation. So it was a great way for investment companies and the investment industry, and as well as oil and gas operators, to see where trends were moving at the time. So it was a really fun project, and we got it knocked out. And they ended up giving me a budget. We actually came in under budget and under time on that, and we were real happy to roll that out. And it was met with great success. We did the thing with the interactive GIS map so that you could actually see where on the map those rigs were. Internally, it was a little bit cooler than that because you could click on each one of those rigs and it would pull up all the information for that rig, who the operator was, what depth they were at, all that kind of stuff that we were able to use internally for our own marketing intelligence and that type of thing. So it was a really powerful tool, and it's still being used today. They've modified it a little bit, of course, over 20 years, but it's still a powerful tool. After that, one of the downturns came, and I left Baker. I bounced around a little bit and ended up at Halliburton about 6 years ago, not knowing that Halliburton was trying to acquire Baker because it hadn't announced yet. But when they interviewed me, they said, "Well, we need you over here to run our monologuing operation, but there's some other things that you'll be involved in." And I just, okay. Sure. Well, it turns out the next week they announced the attempted buyout. So I was heavily involved in that whole, I don't want to call it a fiasco, but it was a fiasco. But that was very interesting, to say the least.
Wow.
But
were they going to call it Baker Burton, or what were they going to call it?
It was
Halla Hughes, or
it was going to be the we had a lot of internal jokes about it. It was going to be Halliburton Baker Hughes, but the Baker Hughes was going to be silent. There was no question. Halliburton was buying Baker Hughes. It wasn't a merger.
Okay.
So
Man, so you go back to managing mud logging.
yeah, and that
Halliburton.
both of them, yeah, and both of those divisions were about a $200 million a year business.
Man.
So it was, as the global product manager, I was in effect over everything.
Mhm.
I had P&L responsibility that was shared with the geographies, but if things weren't working out right every month, I got called on the carpet. Um,
What? How many
but
units? What was the peak? Peak number?
Well, smaller than most. Usually, we would run both of those companies would typically run about 250 units
Around the world.
around the world,
Whew.
maybe a little bit more. But I was also responsible for all the technology that came out of those groups. So we had to keep the technology pipeline full. I had technology teams working under me. We worked closely with the marketing and the legal departments and patents and the whole thing. In effect, I was running our business. We had just instead of me having to go out and borrow money from a bank, we in effect borrowed it from the corporation when we had to do things. So, needless to say, it was an interesting life. So and then about a year ago, Halliburton decided that it was time for me to retire, and I got back into the consulting side. I'd had a consulting business a number of years ago, actually going back to what we're going to be talking a little bit about today, the '82 crash. Uh, I was involved in some interesting consulting work during that period of time uh, with companies that oil and gas operators that, in effect, the value because of the drop in the value of the asset, the oil, had dropped well below their loan value. By law, the banks had to call their loans. So
Mm.
I formed a consulting company, did quite a bit of lobbying up in D.C. that we kind of discovered some very obscure uh, um, uh, Federal Accounting Standard Board uh, guidelines that would allow a lender to not call the loan, but take a small percentage of the value of the loan and then, in effect, refinance that loan at a lower rate. So we saved quite a few little companies during
Oh.
that time. And then we ran out of legitimate companies and people were just, stealing stuff. So
Yeah.
we got away from that.
Quick random question for
Yes.
the mud logging stuff. You're mud logging long before the unconventional
Oh, yeah.
play takes off.
Yeah.
So we hear from old timers and people from the Permian, and we talk about when you drill up, you mud up, and you're drilling through those pesky shale intervals in the Permian Basin. They're drilling through the Wolfcamp, trying to get to those Devonian bumps.
Yep.
What did that actually look and sound like? Like when you guys were learning about, when that drill bit hits this temperature anomaly, it hits this this mud that kicks like a banshee. Like what was that like? What was it like managing that, and why was
What,
it there?
well, I didn't have any experience actually no experience in U.S. land other than some very, very early work down in South Texas on the more of the conventional stuff. But all of my experience, as a matter of fact, both Baker and Halliburton primarily were deep water operations and fairly exotic stuff. We left the Permian stuff more to the smaller independent mud logging companies because of the pricing differences.
Mm-hmm.
But those types of shales were not unusual even in our day of drilling. In the fact that you had very seldom is anything a complete and total surprise. You always saw trends of stuff happening, particularly if you know the formation, you know the geology. There are certain markers, certain indicators that you're getting ready to get into something that's changing, and sometimes sometimes we would convey that and be believed, and things would be okay. Sometimes we convey it and they didn't believe us, and trouble happened.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was reminded while we were talking about there was a post about temperature anomalies with using fiber optics, and you made a comment about back in the day,
Yeah.
the mud loggers were they were amazing at mapping these temperature anomalies.
Yeah, because temperature theoretically, if Mother Nature plays right and there is no problem, the temperature gradient gradually increases with depth, and you expect to see a nice smooth transition from lower to higher temperatures as you get deeper with pressure and everything else. Well, what happens is when there's a pressure anomaly, a seal where there's greater pressure below that seal than above the seal, it acts as a I guess you'd call it like a temperature barrier, and
Yep.
so you see a change in that temperature, and that was one of the old mud logging techniques, is the fact that we would measure the temperature of the mud going in and try to measure that same packet of mud as it circulated down the well and came back up, so that we could look at a differential temperature. And when that differential temperature was different from zero, or some known factor, there was something getting ready to happen downhole.
Wow.
You were drilling into a problem.
Wow.
So that was one of the things that we used to track pretty carefully when I was out in the field doing pore pressure work.
It makes sense because the reservoir is an insulator. So
Yeah.
it creates this big temperature structure in the ground if you're just looking at temperature. So
That's right.
now
So
you can go around mapping the edges of that thing, and shit, that could tell you exactly where you're at, how big it is, and how much you got.
yeah, but then LWD came along and they threw all the mud loggers out. So they thought they were a lot better with the LWD tools than what the old mud loggers used to do.
Oh, man.
If you think about, mud logging was one of the very first formation evaluation tools that the industry had. Uh, they were the guys out there with the magnifying glass that were looking at the rocks, tasting the rock. They would log the well. In effect, every foot they would make a comment of what the rate of penetration was. If they had some way to monitor the gas values that were coming out, that's what a mud log did, and it told them very much about what was happening with that formation that they were drilling into. And prior to the advent of LWD, that was really the only real-time situation that the geologist had on knowing what was going on in their formation.
Wow. I did not think about how we went from physically measuring what was happening at the drill bit with the mud logger in the unit, chasing that stuff, watching that stuff, to LWD coming out. Because we just did a show with Erdos Miller.
Yep.
And that's a huge technology bump, guys, there. And their LWD comes out, and then we stop relying on physical
measurements. Yeah.
physical description. Now
And
we go mechanical.
and all LWD and wireline measurements actually are indirect measurements. They're sending out some sort of electrical wave, be it an acoustic, electrical, or radiation, that looks at the reaction of that wave to what they expect. Whereas a mud logger actually looks at the rock, touches the rock, looks at it under a microscope, looks at it under a UV light, measures the gas that's coming out, not just measures it, but do a full analysis with either a high-end chromatograph or a mass spectrometer.
I mean, it's ground truth data. That's what it is. Yeah, opposed to a secondary measurement, right? Coming off one of those LWDs.
Absolutely.
Would you guys support the comment? Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Going to the Texas Railroad Commission and saying that every well that gets drilled, it must be sat by a mud logger. You cannot drill without having someone watching those cuttings, watching the drill bit. We're not there yet. We're gonna think that we are with technology, but we're not.
Yeah, I hate to get government involved in anything, but for safety purposes, I absolutely agree with that. Now, there's some really cool stuff coming out there with the safety side of it, but as far as the evaluation piece, once those rocks, I always used to say, talk to particularly the drillers who are always cost conscious. Oh, that all this stuff is going to cost me money. I said, you're making those rocks, you're making those cuttings for free. Why just throw them away? Why not at least try to do some sort of analysis on them? And that, I think we need to start looking at some of that better.
And I think that brings a point up that you brought up in the article about how much we're underutilizing this data, and how great that this obviously it's not great, but the opportunity this downturn gives to go back and look at that data and begin to optimize it, because there is so much mud logging data out there that's just not being used for formation evaluation, especially in field development, right? It's just
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, sorry.
No,
John.
no, absolutely. I was agreeing with you. I mean,
Yeah.
there are a couple of really good companies that are starting to do some of that right now. Um, and again, it kind of goes back to my article in the JPT, is that the real winners on this are the small boutique niche companies that do specialize in this, have been doing this for a number of years, that really understand it. The problem is that all too often the economics of drilling these factory wells has thrown out the opportunity to do some true reservoir formation evaluation
Yeah.
analysis of what's
Mhm.
happening. And that's one of the reasons why the Permian had so many problems, in the fact that they were very often out of zone with the lateral. They didn't understand the rocks that they were trying to frack. They were fracking in the wrong place, using some of the wrong technology or some of the wrong methodology. And then they scratch their heads as, well, why aren't we getting the life of the well that we were going to expect? After 6 or 8 weeks, the production dropped off by 90%.
6 to 8 weeks. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And yeah, we'll frack into it. I mean, that was the idea, right? Oh,
Well, yeah, let's-
frack
Well,
into
it's going
it.
to get everything, right?
Yeah, let's
You
go
know,
out and
the good,
cowboy
the
frack.
bad. Yeah.
If we pumped 500,000 pounds of sand on the last well, let's pump 1,000,000 pounds. We'll get twice as much. Well, a lot of times, if you don't know where that sand is going and that the fluid is going, you're not doing anything. You're actually doing more harm than good.
Mhm.
So unless you understand the rocks, if you understand, if you know a little bit about how lithology works, the shales that they wanted to frack were the very friable, very low in clay content, whereas the shales they didn't want to frack because nothing would happen would be the let's use a scientific term, the gooey ones that that no matter how much pressure or sand you tried to pump into them, it just didn't work. So all that pressure and sand that you were trying to put there went somewhere else. And usually it would go into the very friable rock and extend that frac way beyond where you wanted it to, often going into faults, often going into other well bores, and it just turned into a mess. Yeah.
Yeah. It's going
What?
behind pipe. It's just
Yeah.
a nasty.
It's going where you don't know where it's going. And that's the problem.
Well, I mean,
So they could have
that's
done a better job on those.
no question about it. And that's ultimately what sparks the whole thing with PBE, this show. The Band-Aid has been ripped off.
Oh yeah.
And what is under that Band-Aid is the Permian Basin. It's a huge wound that exposes an incredibly smart, incredibly innovative collective mindset that went into these reservoirs thinking they had what they needed to make this thing work. And at $120 a barrel, business worked.
Yeah.
But business is not a technical success. That has nothing to, they could care less on what we thought was happening. They just said, hey, you're making money, try to make more money.
That's
and you're
right.
going, yeah, of course.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, completely misinterpreted.
Yep.
The play is
As the title to this little quick presentation I put together, there's a sucker born every minute.
well, let's pull up that JPT article. What I'm interested in about the JPT article was, how did they approach you? Where was your mindset when you wrote this? I'm interested in what was the impact in your opinion that when you wrote it, and then maybe some of the results and some feedback you got after putting it out there. What did you find the most interesting from this article?
Well, it's kind of like the way you contacted me. I've been fairly active on LinkedIn since I'm retired. I've always been vocal and outspoken, but working for a big company, you have to be careful about your vocality and outspokenness, because your boss is going to come thump you on top of the head and say you weren't supposed to say that. Well, now that I don't have a boss, I can kind of speak my mind a little bit more freely. I try not to be negative about any particular company or any organization. I'm just trying to speak the truth as far as the industry is concerned, at least as I know it. So apparently, one of the editors at JPT had been following some of my comments, and I'd made some about some of the problems with the I remember what it was. I listened in on all the earnings calls from Schlumberger, Halliburton, Baker, and they were all announcing these $1 billion cuts in their investment. and how they were going to save the organization $1 billion. And I started scratching my head. And having been an executive in both of those, at least two of those companies, I'm saying, well, where do they spend $1 billion? Oh yeah, it's in the technology departments. So I made a comment that said, it sounds like they're just absolutely shutting down any new growth on technology. So I made that comment, and they said, they contacted me, said, could you give us some more detail on that? Would you mind writing a 15 to 1800 word article to explain what you mean? And so I did, and it basically came down to one of the points that I made in it is the bad thing about the technology departments being shut down is that means that once they laid all of these people off and have shut down investment in any new technology, it's going to be about 4 years before we see anything new out of these big companies. Because it'll take a year and a half to rehire the number of people. If they decided tomorrow that, hey, we need to start cranking out new technology, it'll take about a year and a half to rebuild that technology group, the engineers, the researchers, everything else that were laid off. And then they can start working on some new ideas as far as, hey, we need this new widget that can measure this parameter. And that takes about 2 years to go through a traditional pipeline of development. So we're probably 4 years away now, unless it happens tomorrow, on a technology response. But I did say, at least the good news is that all of those companies had done a great job in the last 3 or 4 years of pumping out a whole bunch of really cool technology. The bad thing is that a lot of the operators were not using a lot of that new technology. So at least now that investment may actually start paying for itself with these service companies, because at least they have some new toys to play with and some things that will help the operators find some more of that oil and gas that they're looking for.
I think that's a phenomenal point, especially because, the technologies that came out, such as like NMR and all the different measurements for, like on the geochemistry side, like we have all of this phenomenal data. And it was, like you said, it was just, all right, we drilled the well, we have this data, we're going to stow it away, and then we're probably never going to really look at it again. And one of the big problems, and a good friend of the show, Richard Pagel, brought this up, was we're still using Archies to calculate water saturation for unconventional reservoirs. And we all know that doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. So using all this technology and all this data that we now have, like NMR and all this geochem data, can we now do look backs and actually develop a proper equation for these individual reservoirs to figure out, hey, when we're drilling through X kind of rock, right, something that's a little more, and I'll use that term, gooey, or something that's a little bit more brittle, right, can we actually figure out what the deliverability would be in these zones? Something that's actually...
Absolutely. And the good news is the data's still there. So they can go back and do the look back. They can take a look at it. It doesn't help what happened up until now, because they had this concept of factory drilling. Poke as many holes in the ground as fast as you can, and just, and by the time some of the true scientists within the operators had a chance to review the data that was there were probably 8 to 10 wells ahead of them from that past well. So it just wasn't being looked at, and those guys were not being paid attention to. So now maybe it'll afford the opportunity for the operators who were really serious about this to start maybe doing it right this time.
That's right. That's what I liked about the article the most, in my opinion, was it reminded me that science pushes technology. Technology gets backed up against the wall. It responds to science breakthroughs. Science gets put back up against the wall. Technology reaches limits. Science comes back. And I think that's exactly where we are today. And that's exactly what this wound it has exposed, is that science must make a breakthrough. And when that starts happening, which it is, it's totally happening, and we're living through this, technology is going to respond. And those super major service companies, all these boutique companies, somebody's going to invent that thing that everybody needs and that nobody's thinking about today.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and again, the article, I pointed out that a lot of the innovative technologies did come out of the major OFS companies, but some of the really cool stuff didn't necessarily. I go back, I'm old enough to remember when all drilling was done with a rotary table, even before top drive. Well, Top Drive came along, and it was really hard sell to convince the drilling contractors to put that Top Drive system on their rig. Because they were expensive. They're about $1 million a piece. They had to modify their rigs. They had to do a lot of things. They just were very reluctant to do it. But now I would challenge anybody to find a decent rig that didn't have a Top Drive on it. The same thing with rotary steerable systems, where the first one on the market was the AutoTrack tool from Baker. I actually worked on the team that both developed and marketed that initially. You can't imagine the reluctance that we had, not only from the drilling contractors, but also from the operators. Said, man, we've been drilling directional wells the same way for the last 100 years. Why do we need to change? Well, again, I would challenge you to find there are not many wells drilled directionally without some sort of rotary steerable system today. Right. Again, same with MWD and LWD. So the innovation is there. The innovation can be game changing, and it's not always the major companies that are doing that innovation. A lot of the better ideas are coming from the smaller companies. Usually what happens, a bright guy with a great idea doesn't know how to market it. He doesn't have the money to do it. He contacts one of the major service companies, and they end up buying him. And that's how they inherit their technology. And it's not always a bad thing. That technology does get developed. Sometimes it gets lost in the shuffle of the big companies, but at least it becomes available. So that's why I see the future not necessarily being bundled into the factory type drilling, but the smarter operators are going to take a look at what are the specific needs for this particular project. What measurements do I need to take? What measurements don't I need to take? What methodology do I need to use? And then start getting back to being the smarter operator by picking and choosing the various companies that can help them out, rather than this horrid thing that happened when the major oil and gas companies were forcing the service companies to bundle their offering. But bundling was just a way of shoving prices down. So, one of the examples I used, well, we'll use your expensive LWD system if you give us the mud logging for free.
Wow.
And that happened very often.
But it's never free. That's the thing.
First of all, it's never free. And even if it is, it ends up hurting everybody, because number one, you're not going to spend a lot of money on personnel to run that free operation. You're not going to invest any money in it as far as growing it or putting new equipment out there or anything else like that. So both the operator and the service company greatly get harmed by that mentality.
Not moving the needle at all.
No.
Neither of them. Son of a bitch.
Yeah.
Well, let's dive into the drill down section of this show. Are you ready for it?
Absolutely.
Let's now begin the drill down segment of the PBE podcast with Mr. Duncan Blue. Sir, the title attributed to P.T. Barnum. I mean, if nobody is excited about this, just seeing this page, I don't know what gets them excited. I'm ready for this.
All right, thanks. Well,
Wall Street boys are not happy right now.
No. And they're going to be less happy once I start explaining some of this. So go to the next one, and you guys are definitely not old enough to remember this, but Mr. Peabody and Herman with his Wayback Machine. This was from the old Bullwinkle the Moose cartoon. Herman was the kid, and Mr. Peabody was the super intelligent dog that built this time machine, and they went way back. So, like I said, let's join Herman and Mr. Peabody to go back to the bust of 1982. And a lot of this comes from the book Funny Money by Mark Singer, and it talks about this tiny little neighborhood bank called the Penn Square Bank in Oklahoma City. It was basically a shopping mall bank that became one of the world's largest oil and gas brokers. And it nearly brought the entire American banking system to its knees. And the book talks about nowhere else did money flow in quite such spontaneous fashion, and all for the wrong reasons. So we talk about Penn Square. Its value started off as, like I said, typical neighborhood bank where they, I need a new car. I will get a car loan from them. I want to put a new roof in my house. Went from about 25 million to 452 million, still not real big, but because they were located in Oklahoma City, and they had a guy who believed in the oil and gas industry. They became the expert in oil lending for the entire nation. Two of the other big banks that were involved in this, one of them no longer exists, was Continental Illinois National Bank and Trust Company. It had assets of about 40 billion. It was the 7th largest commercial bank in the U.S., and it was just amazing. And then, of course, Chase Manhattan, today's valuation about 460 billion. They've got over $2 trillion in reserves or in assets. But they wanted to get in the oil and gas lending, so they hired McKinsey and Company, one of those great companies that do things, that they recommended they get involved in the oil and gas with loan participation. So those are kind of the players of how all this happened. So in 1982, I've got some numbers here, and I don't want to get too heavy with them, but I've got some spot numbers and I've got some average numbers on the next slide. But we went from 4,530 rigs operating in the U.S. down to 1,807 rigs in 6 months. That was a 25% drop. In 2020, now a little bit longer time, we went from 1,083 rigs back in December 28th of 2018 down to 374 just a couple of days ago or last week. That's a 66% drop. A little longer period of time, but still a very dramatic drop. And to kind of pull all this together, and this is still true today, a bankruptcy lawyer said, you've got 13,000 oil and gas companies in Oklahoma, 1,300 oil and gas companies, 13, I can't see the, hold on, let me move this out to the side. Yeah, 13,000 oil and gas companies in Oklahoma, and maybe 1,500 are looking for oil and gas. The rest are looking for investors. And that is still the case today. So there's a lot of guys with a lot of great prospects to drill. They just don't have the money to do it. So anyhow, so if you take a look at at this kind of look back, you see 1982 with the green circle, and you can see the buildup from the late 60s all the way up to right around 400, almost 500 rigs, and then the dramatic drop once the bottom fell out, and then the slow but steady climb from that, and it never did really go up very high. You know, just basically looking at a high of about almost 2,000 rigs in the early teens here, and then the dramatic drop off. But the swings in the movement of the rig count has been phenomenal. Basically, what we're saying is that we haven't really had a very steady oil and gas industry in the United States for a number of years because of price fluctuations, commodity pricing, regulations, a lot of things, and it's just driven our rig count crazy. What made then back in '82 so strange and it's very similar today is this concept of debtor's leverage. That, you know, basically saying if somebody owes a bank or an investment company $100,000 and he can't pay it back, that guy lies awake at night trying to figure out, you know, what's going to happen. But if he owes them $10 million, the lending institution and the investment company is the one that lies awake at night because, you know, when you owe 100,000, the bank controls you. When you owe 10 million, you control the bank. So that's kind of the situation we were in the 80s, and it's kind of the same situation we're in now. And that's why the investment companies for so many years in the Permian kept throwing what I'd call good money after bad, is that the promise of more and more production coming out of that Permian was so attractive and so sexy that we just need to invest a little bit more money. We're gonna really make a bunch. The reality is that wasn't there. I pulled up an article from 2016 talking about several of the bigger players out in the Permian, and one of the major problems that I've seen in the Permian is the fact that at any given time, some of these operators are paying up to $60,000 an acre for these wells. Yeah. Just of course the economics are not going to work out when you're paying that kind of money for acreage, just for acreage. This is before the wells even drilled.
Yeah.
So, you know, and of course the operators are constantly pounding the service companies over the heads. You got to give us cheaper services. You got to give us cheaper prices. And yet they're paying $60,000 per acre. And some of these acreage holdings were hundreds and hundreds of acres. So imagine how much money they were spending on that.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's take a look at conventional wells that are being drilled in South Texas, we're looking at some in Matagorda County. We're looking at some in South Louisiana. We can pick up acreage for anywhere between $200 and $300 an acre.
That's where I want to be.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So that's the difference, you know. So that's some of the things that just didn't make sense. And anybody with any sense would have looked at that 5 years ago and said, "There's got to be something wrong here."
Yeah.
So yeah, that's part of the problem. So you know why the investors are evacuating the Permian and why they have is so basically only a handful of the independent shale firms actually collected or made more than they spent. So the total overspending was $6.69 billion in 2018. Again, it's chasing the good money after the bad. We keep throwing money into it, and we're just not making any money. And cash really is king. You know, it's they want the quick profit. They have little use for statistics on reserves or, you know, the promises of soaring production. I'm going to give you $100, and in 6 months I want $1,000 back.
Yeah.
And that's all these investors are interested in, and that's really all they should be interested in. It's up to the oil and gas companies.
Yeah, like you were kind of saying at first, right? You could get away with this because you had these, you know, these companies that come in, they drill 1 or 2 wells, they'd be successes, and then the big operator like SM, Concho, or, you know, some of the other operators that you have would be like, oh, this is buttoned up right next to us, let's just acquire it, right? And then you know, and all of a sudden they're paying, like you said, $40,000 to $60,000 an acre, which makes no sense.
Oh no!
But
you know,
somehow they took they could stack up a bunch of potential well bores over all that acreage that they pick up based on 1 or 2 results, and
the
then
DUCs,
their reserves. Boom! If we drill this, the amount of money to be made was just insane because they just extrapolated it.
Yeah,
way too much.
You know, we say our B factor is this, and all of a sudden, oh man, we're making, you know, 100 or 200% rate of return. It's insane.
Yeah. Well, and not only that, what got us into a lot of trouble with the DUCs, the drilled and incompletes, because they were estimating the reserve estimates on those DUCs were based on the science of drilling the first well. Well, we estimate that this reservoir is going to hold, you know, so many 100 million barrels of oil. Well, until they started producing it and seeing the problems associated with the production of those wells, those reserve estimates really weren't quite right.
Yeah.
And the value of those DUCs were virtually zero, but they still completed them anyway.
Yeah, those parent-child relationships. I mean, the understanding of that when this first took off was very, very. I'm trying to think of a nice word, but I want to say people didn't understand it. Let's just leave it at that. Yeah.
Well, very fuzzy, and the investment community, just as the banks were back in the 80s, were desperate to find a place to put money. The market was pretty stagnant, although growing. But back in 10 years ago, it was definitely not growing. They had a lot of cash. They wanted to do something with it. They wanted to do some good things for their investors and the people that put money in these investment companies, and they saw this promise from the knowledgeable people in the oil and gas industry, very much like the same result from the guy at Penn Square Bank who had become the expert of oil and gas investment. They started throwing money at it, and what's even more dramatic is the fact that some of the wells that our group is starting to look at right now, the production behind pipe and the abandoned wells and these kind of things that we're really looking at in East Texas and certain parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, it's as if they shut the spigot off. And what I mean by that is there were some great wells, some good little production coming out of these wells, long-term production. I'm talking wells that have been producing for 10, 15 years at a steady rate with very little decline curve. And then all of a sudden they just abandoned them. Well, it turns out it was about the same time that first the Austin Chalk came along. the shiny object or the dog chasing the
Oh, yeah.
squirrel, and then it went out to the Permian with the unconventionals. Well, the money follows the money, and everything else is ignored and abandoned.
Mhm.
So
Even cash
and
flow.
and I and
Yeah.
I think that's also the big part of the problem with oil and the banking industry is there's never really been a clean connection, right? Because it's
No.
like, okay, we'll drill this well and we'll make our money back in 2 years, but like you said, the decline is like such a rate that we're going to be making like hand over fist like 10 years down the road. But with unconventionals, it's, hey, by the end of the year you're going to be making 30% of your money back.
Yeah.
And it's just all of a sudden that and like you said, that new shiny thing, right?
Oh, yeah.
That big dollar value is what attracted all those investors. And
How does this relate to 82? How does this
Well, the same thing happened in the fact that the wells, the production was a little different in the fact that a lot of it was still there, but the promise of the investment dollar, and the rush to get that cash in the oil and gas industry, you ended up having a bunch of doctors and lawyers and dentists. And there's one example in the book, a guy who was a used car salesman said, well, he delivered a car. He said, this is the last car I'll ever sell because I'm starting an oil company. And literally that was going on. And the banks, again, were desperate to put money into these things with virtually zero chance for success, but it was the shiny object that they were chasing after. So that's kind of, it's the operators who were successful didn't quite get as hurt as bad, but it's the guys who thought they knew the oil and gas industry that started drilling wells or owning rigs or farming a mud company or doing whatever it was that they were borrowing this money for and having money thrown at them indiscriminately. It collapsed upon its own misfortune, I guess, or stupidity, or however you want to call it. So that's how the similarity comes in there.
Okay. And what is if you just said oil and gas investment dollars, and that's a whole 100% pie, how much of that investment went to operators versus service companies?
Oh, the majority of it went to the operators, but the operator with their demand, particularly in the Permian, the operators with their demand were desperate to find equipment, desperate to find crews, desperate to get anything. You remember the stories not too many years ago where a guy working in a McDonald's was getting paid $40 an hour because there were no people left to hire at the McDonald's because they were all working out in the oil field.
Right.
So companies were popping up overnight to support the drilling operations of these, so-called hot fields where people wanted to start drilling. So in 82, a lot of the money was being borrowed by service companies and operators, whereas this time around, the investment community were dumping the money in the oil and gas companies, and then the demand from the oil and gas companies grew the service side of it that's being hurt so bad today.
Wow.
So it's a dog chasing its tail kind of thing, I guess, is a way to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
I'll catch it, but I don't know what to do with it when I get it. Or I'll catch it and hold on to it until somebody tells me different, right? So anyhow, yeah, that was the last slide I had on that. So yeah.
One of the comments that we talked about that caught my attention to really do this show, and can you just share the screen? You can leave it black or on a page. It's just how the video recording software works.
Sorry.
No problem. Bringing it back. Nice.
Okay.
Yeah, you can just leave it on that or the front page, whatever you want.
I'm seeing blank, so it doesn't matter. Yeah.
Okay. So the comment we brought up, and I think you were saying in the post that initially got us in contact with this show was the in 83, the concept that we were running out of oil.
Yeah.
And the difference today, and I would say that, without question, everybody in industry and even looking at it is going, okay, we're never running out of this thing. We know that.
Yeah, back then, that's when this concept, and I can't remember the professor who came up with it, peak oil came about, where we've discovered, we know where all the oil is, and it's a very finite resource, and that the world's coming to an end because within 20 years we're gonna have pumped all the oil out of the ground and we won't have anything else.
Man.
Okay, that's not true. We're finding new and bigger fields every day. We're finding new technology. If you think about it, for so many years, we would drill a well, we would produce it. The production would finally drop off to a point where it wasn't economical to keep going anymore. But we'd probably only drain 25% of the oil in that reservoir out. So, Matt, you probably have run across this in your completion days, where then you go into secondary recovery and tertiary recovery and all the things that are around that. So there's always stuff there. So
the planet is bleeding hydrocarbon.
And especially the techniques that they're bringing in now, with these different EOR methods and carbon sequestration. And hey, we can sweep this reservoir. We don't need to flood it with water anymore. Let's pump CO2 into it and just pull every little bit of oil out of it.
Yeah, I was on the phone Monday with a friend of mine who has a company, and he wanted my opinion on his technology. I'm sorry, I can't even remember the name of the company, but he's got a plasma device that can either be on surface or actually go down hole, that he superheats water and nitrogen to flood the formation. But it's unique in the fact that they can very carefully control the temperature of that nitrogen and water so that it doesn't get to the point where it destroys the hydrocarbons or anything else. And it's like a pulsed plasma that they can very quickly control. Yeah.
So it's like an on-site steam flood, right?
Yeah.
So you can just basically have this water flooding mechanism and then just put this tool either downhole or attach it at surface and steam flood your reservoir.
Yeah. If the reservoir is shallower than 2,500 feet, they can do it on surface. If it's deeper, they can run it down hole. And the beauty of it is it comes on two 18-foot trailers, and they can move on location and be rigged up in about a day and a half. They stay on location for about a week till they have put enough steam out into the formation where it'll come back, or they can even have it set up on a permanent location. If it's a major field, they can do the traditional steam flood where they constantly pump down on the flood well to the collection wells. And apparently it's not very expensive technology, but it's kind of cool in the way that it hit the concept behind it. So like I said, the boutique, the very niche players on this type of new technology is really going to be the key to the future, I think.
Oh man, we definitely know. I want to know the name of that company. We'll plug it in when you can remember that. That's really interesting stuff. You're increasing the energy of the system by increasing the temperature.
Well, you're allowing the oil to flow a little bit better through the pores and the porosity with the connected permeability. Oil is fairly viscous, no matter what the API gravity of it is. It's more viscous than steam, but by heating it up, it tends to lower the viscosity and allow it to flow through those formations better. And so you have a better sweep of that hydrocarbon.
No question about it.
Now it doesn't do much for gas, but it's only after the oil. But gas is a whole nother story that don't get me started on that, because it's the whole concept of the United States does not and never has had a true energy policy. If we had a true energy policy, we would be going after the natural gas for our own use. And when I say our own use, if we were smart, tomorrow the president or Congress would come in and say, okay, we're going to give everybody a $1,200 grant to put this little converter in their car to go from liquids to natural gas. Support the oil and gas industry to say, put compressor stations at every one of your filling stations where you can fill your car up with natural gas, compressed natural gas. And it's inexpensive, probably one of the most efficient burning hydrocarbons that are out there. And it's virtually unlimited in the United States and in a lot of other areas in the world.
I mean, when we were out working in the Permian, I mean, we'd be driving down the 191 and just the flares would just be flowing and going, and you're just
horrid.
How much energy is just being wasted right now? And it's just, we have so much gas, especially in these unconventional wells, and that's what people don't realize is you're looking for that gas oil ratio where you're having enough gas to drive this fluid into the wellbore. And it's, what do we do with the gas afterwards? We send it to Waha and they burn it off. That's
Yeah, and even worse, it had gotten so bad that operators were paying people to take their gas because they had to do something with it. They didn't want to flare it. Some of the regulations weren't allowing that to happen. And it's like, how stupid could you be? You're burning off probably one of the best hydrocarbons on the planet and using this nasty liquid stuff that should, and I'm not saying liquids are bad, they should be used for all the things that they're used best for. Plastics and pharmaceuticals and all the other things that the chemical composition of the liquids are best used for, not for burning in an internal combustion engine.
Yep. And we just transitioned from the drill down section to the completion section.
Oh, sorry about that.
That was a great segue.
That was good. Totally planned.
Oh, okay, yeah, of course. I'm reading the script right now. Yeah.
That was a great transition, and exactly where we need to go with the completion part of this. We understand the situation that we're in. We're making adjustments to what this COVID thing is doing to the world and how it's responding, and we need an energy policy.
Yes.
That just makes good sense to bring up and raise the awareness of who's writing this potential thing, and how is this getting pushed forward. You have great ideas. LinkedIn should be supporting you as the energy policy man on LinkedIn.
Well, let's not go that far. Okay. I'm only good on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Tuesday and Thursdays, I'm shot. So that's
well, can you explain, and it's sorry to draw this out, but just explain, the difference in the mindset that we have right now moving forward and trying to adjust with this new projected future, going forward without an energy policy versus going forward with an energy policy.
Well, I think if we don't come up with a consolidated energy policy for the U.S., we're going to end up back the same place we've been for the last 15 booms and busts. The price of oil will go up to $100 a barrel. Everybody go crazy. Things are great. Let's spend as much money as we can. And then the bottom will drop out. And by energy policy, I don't mean, we're going to restrict the amount of oil and gas that we produce, or we're going to be, we're going to nationalize oil and gas companies. I don't mean that at all. I'm talking about a concerted effort where the government and the operators can get together in a forum that with guidelines that say, okay, here's the direction we want to go in. How can we best fit that? Some of it goes back to the old monopoly days where competitors can't talk to each other about stuff like that. And maybe that idea is still a great idea, but we've got to have some sort of cooperation on based on the needs of the nation, being defense needs or being commerce needs. We've got to do a better job of how these commodities that we own are better controlled and better utilized.
Yeah, a way for us to become energy independent and as well as continue to export. But I mean, I think that needs to be a priority.
That's right. Because we're one of the only countries that don't do that. I mean, as much as we all like to curse OPEC and as much as we like to curse all these other countries, they operate differently. A lot of people don't understand the difference between an independent oil and gas company or even a major oil and gas company versus a national oil and gas company. The national oil and gas company, like Equinor, used to be Statoil, or even BP, or some of these others. But particularly in the Middle East, the idea of their oil and gas companies is not so much how much oil can we produce. It's on their perspective, it's how much can we take our own people and utilize our own people in working in this industry and growing this industry for our own needs. And that's why they've gone to this nationalization of trying to get as many outside U.S. companies out of there to where they run their own show. So they don't care about the price of oil and gas as much as they care about how can we put our people to work producing our own energy supply.
Wow.
We're not quite at that point, and we don't need to be at that point because we are good, but we need to at least have a common goal.
I agree with on that front. I definitely do believe we need a common goal. But one thing that I will say I do like about the system that we do have is with these independent companies is that competition
Oh
does
yeah,
breed innovation. I do like that aspect where it's like, hey, our science team is better than your science team, and we're going to prove it by, these next 5 wells we drill. I
that
love that.
absolutely, and we've seen some changes in that. And back in the day, an operator would drill a well, they would tight hole it, they would never share the data, they would never share anything else. And then the government came in and said, okay, after so many years, that data becomes public record. Everybody can take a look at it. That's a good thing, because then you can learn from what they've had their commercial advantage for several years, and then once they in effect make their money and make their money back and make some good profit on it, then share what those formations look like, what techniques they use, how did they do it. So that sort of thing really needs to be fine-tuned and brought into play again.
Man, I mean, Mr. President, I mean, Duncan Blue. What I hear and how I feel when we were talking about that is the fact that, as a young professional that's dedicating the rest of my life to trying to be the best economic geologist I could possibly be, and find efficient energy for our country and our world to be sustained. Ultimately, what we're trying to do as a collective people is build stability. We want a stable economy. Why would I want my child or the future generations around the world to have to struggle through booms and busts? These stories of the front lines of the people in the booms and the busts are insane. It's a roller coaster ride of emotions, and it's tragic, and it's crazy, and we don't need that in our lives. We need stability in the future. We don't.
Yep.
That's what we are working for. That's why when you say energy policy, somebody might cringe and say, no, the government shouldn't be involved in what I do. And no, that's not the point. The point is we have to create stability for the future generations.
That's right. And we've and some of it can be regulations, the nasty R word, but some of those regulations are necessary. For example, look at the airline industry, which is in real bad shape right now. But can you imagine getting on a plane that was not regulated, and they had no rules or regulations as far as safety and maintenance and everything else? It's a crapshoot at that point. So in order to stabilize our industry and provide, and listen, oil and gas is a vital source of our national defense, our national stability. So we've got to stabilize that. I dread the day that the price of oil and gas is no longer measured in U.S. dollars and is measured on some other system. I want to tell you that would destroy this country. And that's a scary thought. So you're right. Now, Troy, you talked about it. Can you imagine being a young, wet behind the ear geologist or a reservoir engineer graduating from university this year saying, okay, I'm ready to go to work? That's terrible. They've invested years of their lives studying, and those are not easy degree programs. I would put them up against just about anything else as far as difficulty and effort and everything else. But I mean, you don't know from one year to the next whether you're going to demand your own salary or be living under a bridge. And I guess that's one of the problems with this industry. I have lived under bridges before. Thank you very much. But I know what it's like. And that's why I encourage all of my kids not to get into the industry. I have one son who is in the industry. He's doing very well. It's with one of the new data companies that I talked about in the article that Troy, you and I talked about earlier, and which I do think is the future of where we're going.
Man.
Yeah.
Like that could really be the
President Duncan Blue and VP Troy Tittlemeyer.
Oh, no thanks. I've been involved in politics before. It's a nasty business.
Oh man, yeah, you're right, and it's something that we're going to transition through, and thank God there's people like you that have the voice on LinkedIn. That's you're providing a lot of great, thoughtful content, and I thank you for that on
Yeah.
LinkedIn without question. Your
Well, thank you.
comments are coming from a really interesting perspective, and the results, and you see the conversations from that perspective that you have, and it drives great conversations. And man, I think I can't believe it, but I think that might be the end of the completion of our show.
Well, there you go.
Oh, wait, I have one last question.
Oh,
I don't know.
yeah,
I don't
let's
want to
go.
derail you. I don't want to derail you.
No.
I have one. So it was in that last section of your article, and this word keeps coming back to this podcast somehow, and I love it, is digital transformation,
Yeah.
right? You're saying your son is working in the data side, and then especially with, the words machine learning and artificial intelligence and all this being thrown around, the neural networks, and actually utilizing all that data that we have effectively. So what are your thoughts on that and the future?
Yeah, Matt, thanks for that. I really, man, I tell you what, 10 years ago when they first started talking about this, I poo-pooed it and said, oh man, you're just chasing craziness down. And then I got involved in it, and it was the I can't remember what conference I was at, is that, for years the industry was begging for more data and better data. We don't have enough to analyze what's happened, to the point where we are today. We're drinking from a fire hose with the amount of data that's out there, but we've never done a very good job of analyzing what we're getting. So I really do think, and listen, all of the companies have dabbled at it. Several companies I've worked with have spent millions of dollars playing at it, but they were always these companies, the major oil field service companies are dealing with mechanical tools. Let's build a new widget. Let's color it purple. Let's put a button over on that side of the screen. Let's do that type of thing. And there's always been a small group within each of these companies that said data is the way to go, and understanding and utilizing that data. What I'm encouraged with are some of these, again, smaller niche boutique companies, not the big OFS companies, that have decided to take this concept of artificial intelligence and machine learning that they developed while they were working for the U.S. military or the Defense Department, or even the medical side of the business, that they understand how important that data is if utilized properly. So I really do think that the future of our industry is better measurements that we don't have, because we don't have any standards as far as how these systems that we use to measure things such as weight on bed and pump pressure and all that, even how they're calibrated. So there's no demand for that. So we've got to do a better job of that. But once we gather that data and collect it, how do we analyze that data for a couple of different things? Number one, safety, which is first and foremost. How can we keep these tragedies from happening if we can better understand what's happening with the entire drilling system as we drill the wells? Or even on the production side, can we predict the life of this reservoir? Can we do certain things like chemical injection or changing the downhole pump out, or before we have loss in production? So the analysis of that data is key. And then on the other side, I've got my son-in-law works for one of the biggest oil companies in the world, ExxonMobil, and he's very heavily involved in the data side of it. And it's all about the artificial intelligence and the concept of how the reservoir numbers are analyzed, and how do they make better decisions based on that data that's coming in. So I really think that's going to be it's the next big thing as far as development. Not so much the mechanical pieces of the system, but the analysis of the data that those mechanical systems give us, and the automation of that. My concept has always been, you've got great downhole tools, rotary steerables and LWD and all the other things that go along with that, but we have models, but we've never tied that model to the downhole tool, where the tool can make its own corrections to go into the sweetest spot of the formation. In other words, it drills itself rather than relying on me to be up there making decisions to drill. We should be using our brain power to think of better ways of doing it, not sitting there worried about what's happening every second.
Exactly. That was a fantastic question, Skippo. I can't believe that came back. I missed that digital transformation in the article.
That's all right. I was going to bring it up anyway.
Nice. And you wrapped that up really good by saying
Thanks.
we don't understand the physical world enough for
Yeah.
our automation to say, got this, guys. I'm running the rig. I'm putting us where we want to be because I get it. We don't get it. That's where we're at.
That's right. That's right. And we need to do a much better job of that. We need to take as many people off of that well site as possible. You know, Equinor had several conferences that I went to. Equinor had this concept of a manless rig, and they said, "Oh, it can't be a manless. We'll have to have a man and a dog out there." The man is out there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to bite the man if he tries to touch the rig. So I don't think we'll ever get to that point, because we'll still have to intervene when necessary.
Right.
Just think of what would have happened to Apollo 13 if that man hadn't been there that knew how to fly that capsule coming back, because all the computers were dead.
Right.
Yeah, he had to be there. We should only be there for an emergency and to think of different opportunities that may lay ahead of us, rather than having to feel like we have to physically touch it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
What the? Now that Apollo 13, it's funny you bring that up. We were just talking about the moon because they did that flyby with higher resolution of the moon. And
On the
all that.
backside, yeah.
Yeah. And the freaking something goes off. They don't have enough power to get back. So they slightly adjust their trajectory. They use the gravitational pull of the moon, which is probably, you know, if you miss that.
Oh, you're either burning up in the Earth's atmosphere, or you're off into, you know, out in outer space somewhere. Yeah.
What the heck? And then you're saying, I didn't know there was a guy that specifically knew what to do when they ran out of power.
Well, it was the whole team that did that, but it ended up being, I can't remember the pilot's name, but he was the guy who actually flew that capsule back and controlled the burns and the various things based on the recalculations that there was a movie just out recently where the women of NASA, the unrecognized women of NASA, they even called them computers back then, but they did a lot of the math behind it, and they were heavily involved in that whole operation. So it was a team effort, but it still relied on that man with the stick to bring us back down safely.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, man, I love it. I love where this ended.
Well, great. I tell you what, guys, this was fun.
Duncan, the pleasure was all ours. It's absolute honor.
Thank you for taking the time. I mean, really, really appreciate it.
Sure. Well, I appreciate the what you guys are doing to reach out and talk to people like this. This is important.